I can still remember the scent that lingered in the hallway that night, faint traces of perfume that didn't belong to me. It clung to Mark's shirt collar, too heavy, too deliberate, as if daring me to notice. The way he slipped out of his shoes without looking me in the eye told me more than words ever could. I stood frozen in the doorway of our living room, clutching the empty coffee mug I'd been holding for hours, staring at the man I thought I knew. For years, I believed in the picture-perfect marriage we presented to the world. But in that moment, the surface cracked just enough to show the darkness beneath. The perfume was only a detail, but it was the beginning of a truth I could no longer ignore. Before I continue, tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more family stories where truth and justice always find their way to the light. My name is Elena Brooks. And at 46, I thought I had built the kind of steady, predictable life my younger self used to dream of. I worked as a high school counselor in a suburban district just outside St. Louis, guiding other people's children through their storms, while believing my own home was safe from such turbulence. Mark and I had been married for over 20 years, raising our daughter Lily in the same house where every wall held framed reminders of birthdays, graduations, and family vacations. My father-in-law, Walter, lived only a few streets away, often joining us for Sunday dinners with stories from his years as a contractor. To anyone looking in, we were a family defined by stability, by small-town values, by the kind of love that seemed unshakable. When Mark and I first met in college, I was drawn to his easy charm and quiet determination. He wasn't the loudest in the room, but he had a way of making you feel seen, as if nothing else mattered in that moment. I was studying psychology. He was climbing the ladder in business, and together we thought we could take on the world. Years later, he built a strong career in regional sales while I dedicated myself to my students. Our incomes were comfortable, not extravagant, but enough to give Lily a warm home and a future with possibilities. To outsiders, we were the American dream, holding hands at church socials, showing up to every parent-teacher meeting, and smiling through Christmas cards that painted the illusion of perfection. But behind that image, shadows were forming. They weren't visible at first, only small gestures, tiny cracks that could almost be dismissed. A delay in Mark's return home from business trips, a hesitation when he answered his phone, or a glance exchanged with Tessa, my oldest friend, that lingered a moment too long. I wanted to believe I was imagining things, that my mind was inventing fears where none existed. After all, Tessa had been in my life since high school. She was the friend who helped plan my wedding, who held Lily when she was born, who knew every story from my childhood. To suspect her of betrayal felt like questioning the very foundation of my past. Still, unease began to settle into my days, a quiet hum beneath the routine of work and home. I'd walk through the halls of my school, offering advice about trust and self-worth to teenagers, all while wondering if I was failing to practice what I preached. At night, lying beside Mark, I'd listen to his even breathing and wonder what secrets he was keeping behind that calm exterior. And every time Tessa dropped by with her effortless laugh and endless energy, I found myself studying her eyes, searching for something that might confirm the dread I refused to name. The night I smelled that perfume, the one that didn't belong to me, it was as if the universe finally whispered the truth I had been avoiding. It wasn't loud or dramatic, not yet, but it carried enough weight to shake the ground beneath me. I told myself then that I would find the answers no matter how much it hurt, because silence was no longer an option. The perfume should have been enough to confirm what my instincts already knew. But my mind craved more than a scent on a shirt. I needed something I could see, something undeniable. Suspicion had a way of gnawing at me in the quiet hours, whispering that I was imagining things that decades of marriage couldn't unravel with something so faint. But the small signs grew louder, each one tightening around me like a thread pulling a seam apart. It began with Mark's trips. He claimed they were routine regional meetings, client dinners, overnight stays that were part of his job. For years, I had accepted those explanations without question, trusting that he was working hard to provide for us. But the stories stopped adding up. His schedule shifted with odd excuses. His mileage didn't match the places he said he had been, and his phone, once left on the counter, was suddenly guarded like a treasure. One evening, I glanced across the dinner table and noticed him texting under the surface, his eyes flicking to the screen with a smile he didn't bother to hide. When I asked what was so amusing, he muttered something about an inside joke from work and slid the phone face down far out of my reach. That smile haunted me because it was one I hadn't seen in my direction in a long time. Tessa's presence became heavier too. She found reasons to stop by more often, with excuses ranging from dropping off decorations for a school fundraiser to sharing a new recipe she thought I would like. She came through my front door with her polished nails wrapped around a bottle of wine, laughing as if she belonged there more than I did. I tried to brush away my unease, but my stomach turned each time I caught the flicker of Mark's eyes when she walked into the room. It wasn't just familiarity. It was possession. The kind of glance that says, a secret is already shared. The breaking point came on a Friday night when Mark was supposed to be in Springfield for a client dinner. Lily and I had gone out for pizza, trying to make the best of another evening without him. As we pulled into the driveway, I noticed a shadow move behind the curtains of our living room window. At first, I thought maybe Walter had stopped by, but the light in the room was dim, and the silhouette I saw was taller, leaner. I parked slowly, my pulse racing, and told Lily to grab her backpack and head upstairs as soon as we got inside. The front door creaked open, and there was Tessa standing in the middle of my living room, as if she lived there. She was holding one of my wine glasses, sipping with ease, wearing a sweater I knew I hadn't seen before. She looked startled, but only for a second, then smiled like she had every right to be comfortable in my home. "Elena," she said lightly, "I was just dropping something off for you. Mark told me you'd be home late." I glanced at the clock on the wall. It was barely 9. My eyes swept the room, searching for Mark, but he was nowhere in sight. Tessa's purse sat on the arm of the sofa, open enough for me to see a familiar watch tucked inside a watch I'd given Mark for our anniversary. The moment burned into my mind, but I swallowed my words and chose not to confront her there. Lily was upstairs, and I refused to turn my home into a battleground with my daughter listening in. Instead, I let her talk, let her spin her excuses about needing to borrow a book, about thinking she had mentioned it to me earlier in the week. I nodded, kept my voice calm, and held the door open until she finally walked out with a flutter of her hair. When Mark returned later that night, smelling faintly of the same wine Tessa had been drinking, I asked how his dinner had gone. He launched into a story about clients and late traffic, his tone steady, his expression careful. I didn't interrupt. I didn't accuse. I simply studied the man across from me, noting how he twisted his wedding band without realizing it, how his eyes avoided mine as though they would give away too much if they lingered. From that night on, I began watching more closely. His phone was locked, but I learned to notice the small hesitations when he typed a message. Receipts crumpled in his car told me more than his words did. One showed 2 entrees and a bottle of wine at a restaurant he swore he never had time to visit. Another showed a hotel room charged in the middle of a week when he had supposedly driven home each night. The realization settled in quietly, like dust on furniture left untouched. I wanted to scream to demand the truth, but I held it close instead. At work, I carried on with the same steady presence for my students, smiling and listening while their own dramas unfolded. At home, I played the role of wife and mother, cooking dinners and folding laundry, all while documenting every sign that betrayed the vows Mark once made. It was exhausting, that double life of pretending while my heart fractured in silence. At night, I'd stand at the sink, washing dishes, staring at the reflection in the dark window, wondering if the woman I saw there had become invisible. Tessa's laughter echoed in my head, even when she wasn't near, a reminder that the person I trusted most outside of my marriage had chosen to cross lines that could never be repaired. And still, I stayed silent, for Lily's sake, for Walter's sake, for the small chance that I was wrong. I told myself that rushing to accuse without proof would only hand them power over me. But deep down, I knew. The perfume, the glances, the lies, each one was a stitch in the pattern they had woven together, behind my back. The night I saw Tessa's sweater folded neatly in the back seat of Mark's car, the one she had worn in my living room, I felt the last threads of denial snap. My hands trembled as I closed the door, careful not to slam it. I stood there in the garage, surrounded by the smell of gasoline and cold concrete, realizing that the life I thought I had built was already crumbling. I walked back inside and found Mark at the kitchen table scrolling his phone with a smirk that belonged to someone else. He looked up, surprised to see me watching him. For a moment, our eyes locked, and something in his expression told me he already knew I was beginning to see through him. Silence became my closest companion. I carried it with me to work, to family dinners, to the quiet hours when the house seemed too big around me. My heart knew the truth, but my lips refused to form the words. At first, I told myself it was because of Lily. She was only months away from graduating, her head filled with college applications and scholarship dreams, and I couldn't bear to cloud her final year with the weight of her father's betrayal. But in reality, I was still learning how to carry my own pain without letting it crush me. The nights were the worst. Mark would come home late, the smell of perfume clinging faintly to him, and I would lie awake long after he drifted to sleep. The steady rhythm of his breathing beside me no longer comforted me. It taunted me. I stared at the ceiling, remembering the years when we whispered plans in the dark, when laughter came easily, when our lives seemed tethered together by love rather than obligation. Now every sigh, every shift of his body felt like a reminder that he belonged elsewhere, and I was the one left behind. At school, I forced a smile, listening as teenagers poured their hearts into my office. They spoke about crushes, fights with parents, and dreams of leaving town. I gave them advice I could no longer follow. Myself, trust your instincts. Don't let anyone make you feel small. Stand tall in the truth. The irony of it cut deep, but I kept my voice steady, hiding the storm behind a practiced calm. My colleagues praised my composure. They had no idea that once the students left, I sometimes sat in silence until the bell rang, gripping the edge of my desk, just to hold myself steady. Even simple routines began to unravel. I lost weight without trying meals turning tasteless in my mouth. I stopped meeting friends for coffee because I couldn't bear their questions about how Mark and I were doing. The photographs on the mantel mocked me with smiling faces from vacations and anniversaries. I couldn't take them down, not yet, but each glance reminded me of how far we had fallen. One Saturday morning, I caught Lily studying at the kitchen table, her brow furrowed in concentration. Mark had left early, claiming he had errands to run, though I knew better. As I brewed coffee, Lily looked up and asked, "Mom, are you okay?" Her voice was gentle, but her eyes were sharp, far too perceptive for her age. I forced a smile and told her I was just tired from work. She nodded, but I could see in her expression that she didn't believe me. That moment broke something inside me. My daughter, the child I had shielded for so long, was beginning to see the cracks, no matter how carefully I tried to hide them. Walter visited often, his steady presence a small comfort. He'd knock on the back door carrying a bag of groceries or a container of soup, insisting that he just wanted to help. He would sit at the table asking after Lily's grades, reminiscing about his years in construction, or teasing me about the way I organized my pantry. But I caught him watching me, sometimes his weathered face creased with concern. I wondered if he suspected anything, if the son he had raised was showing him sides that he didn't want to acknowledge. I never gave him reason to ask, though. I folded my sorrow, neatly tucking it away before anyone could catch hold of it. There were moments when I almost convinced myself to let it go, to keep living in the shadows of denial. But the reminders came too frequently. A hotel receipt folded in Mark's jacket pocket. A smudge of lipstick on a handkerchief that wasn't mine. Tessa's laughter drifting through the phone when I picked it up by accident. Each discovery sliced me open all over again, yet I never confronted them. I kept my wounds private, as if silence itself could shield me from the shame of being betrayed by both my husband and my closest friend. I cried where no one could hear me, in the car parked alone in the school lot, or in the shower, where the water could swallow the sound. The tears came not only from betrayal, but from the helplessness of pretending that everything was fine. Pretending required more strength than anger, more patience than confrontation. I began to understand why so many women stayed quiet. It wasn't weakness. It was survival. Still, the weight grew heavier. I started forgetting small things, misplacing my keys, leaving papers unfinished at work, losing track of time during conversations. I was unraveling piece by piece, and Mark seemed to enjoy watching me stumble. He would make small comments, subtle enough to sound innocent, sharp enough to pierce. "You look tired, Elena," he'd say with a smirk, or, "Maybe you should take a step back at work before you burn out." Words that sounded caring to anyone else but felt like stones pressing against my chest. Tessa played her role just as smoothly. She continued dropping by, her voice filled with false cheer, bringing little gifts, or asking casual questions about my schedule. Each visit was a performance, and I played my part, smiling politely while wondering if she saw the tremor in my hands as I poured her coffee. I despised her, but I despised myself more for not sending her away. For every hour I spent in her company, I lost a little more of myself. What neither of them realized was that I was watching, cataloging every move, every lie, every shift in tone. My silence was not just pain. It was preparation. But I was not ready to act, not yet. For now, the tears remained private, the doubts locked inside me. I carried them like stones in my pockets, heavy and unrelenting, dragging me down with every step. One evening, after another long day of feigned normalcy, I stood in the backyard alone. The air was cool, and the faint sound of Lily's music floated from her upstairs window. I closed my eyes and let the quiet wrap around me, searching for the strength I had nearly forgotten I possessed. Somewhere deep inside, I knew I couldn't keep living like this. The hidden pain would eventually consume me unless I found a way to turn it into something else, something stronger. The promise I whispered to myself in the backyard stayed with me like a seed planted deep in the soil. For weeks I carried it quietly, waiting for the moment when it would finally break through. My tears no longer fell as often, and though the pain remained, it began to feel less like something drowning me and more like something sharpening me. It was as if I had finally admitted the truth aloud, even if only to myself, and that admission changed everything. The turning point came on an ordinary afternoon. I was sitting in the counselor's office at school, sorting through scholarship applications, when my phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. At first, I thought it was a mistake, but when I opened it, my chest tightened. The message contained only a photo, Mark and Tessa, sitting close together at a hotel bar, his hand brushing her knee under the table. The timestamp was from the night before one of the evenings he'd claimed to be out late with clients. I stared at the picture for a long time, my hands trembling, but my mind suddenly clear. It wasn't just suspicion anymore. It wasn't fragments of perfume hidden receipts or faint lipstick stains. It was proof. Cold, undeniable proof. And rather than shatter me, it steadied me. The fear that had paralyzed me for months began to fade, replaced by something firmer. I couldn't control what they had done to me, but I could control what I did next. That evening, Mark walked in later than usual. He loosened his tie and kissed me on the cheek, as if nothing were wrong. I caught the familiar scent of Tessa's perfume clinging faintly to his jacket, and for the first time, I didn't flinch. I simply nodded, set down the plate of food I had warmed for him, and studied the man across from me. He didn't notice my calm, or perhaps he mistook it for resignation. Either way, I realized he no longer saw me as a threat. That was his mistake. I began to shift in subtle ways. Instead of questioning his excuses, I accepted them with a smile. Instead of recoiling at Tessa's visits, I welcomed her with polite composure. Inside, I was no longer the woman falling apart at the seams. I was the woman watching carefully, gathering what I needed, preparing for the day when silence would end. It surprised me how quickly my energy returned once I stopped trying to convince myself of lies. I ate meals again, real meals that nourished me rather than sat untouched on the plate. I slept more soundly, not because the pain had gone, but because I knew I had a plan forming. Even my colleagues noticed, remarking that I looked stronger, more present. I didn't tell them why, but inside, I carried the quiet knowledge that I was no longer trapped. One evening after dinner, I excused myself from the living room and walked upstairs to Lily's room. She was sprawled across her bed with textbooks scattered around her, music humming low from her speakers. I sat on the edge of her bed and asked about her day, letting her talk about her classes, her friends, and the college applications she had nearly finished. She looked at me and said, "You seem different, Mom. Like you're lighter somehow." I smiled and brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. She didn't need to know the details, but she deserved to feel the steadiness I was finally reclaiming. Walter stopped by the following Sunday carrying his usual bag of groceries. He sat across from me at the table, sipping coffee, while Mark busied himself in the garage. Walter studied me quietly, his sharp eyes taking in more than I spoke aloud. "You're stronger than you think, Elena," he said suddenly. I looked up in surprise, but he only smiled faintly, as though he knew more than he let on. His words lingered with me long after he left. The following week, Tessa arrived at my house unannounced, carrying a stack of party invitations she wanted my opinion on. I watched her laugh in my kitchen, her voice lilting as she poured herself a glass of iced tea. She moved easily in my home, as though she owned a piece of it already. For the first time, I didn't shrink from her presence. I let her chatter, let her fill the air with her false brightness, while inside me a clarity settled. She had no idea that I was done playing the role of the oblivious friend. When she left that night, I lingered at the door, watching her car disappear down the street. My hands didn't tremble. My breath didn't catch. Instead, I felt a strange calm wash over me. The grief was still there, but it had shifted into something steadier resolve. That night, lying awake in bed, I whispered again the promise I had made weeks earlier. But this time, it was stronger, firmer, no longer fragile words spoken in the dark. I would not live as the victim of their lies. I would not be diminished by their betrayal. I was done with silence, and though they didn't know it yet, the balance of power in our home had already begun to change. The calm I carried inside me became more than a feeling. It became a strategy. I knew I couldn't confront Mark and Tessa with rage or accusations. They thrived on denial, on twisting stories until I appeared fragile or foolish. If I wanted to reclaim my life, I had to move carefully, step by deliberate step, so that when the truth surfaced, there would be no way for them to cover it with lies. The first step was knowledge. I began keeping a small notebook hidden in my purse, recording every detail I observed. Hotel charges, unexplained absences, messages glimpsed on his phone. I wrote it all down with dates and times. The act of writing steadied me. It transformed the chaos of betrayal into a pattern I could study, proof I could hold. At night, I would sit at the kitchen table after Lily had gone to bed, copying receipts and printing bank statements, my hands moving with a precision I hadn't felt in months. I also reached out to someone I trusted beyond my family. James Reed had been a neighbor years ago before he moved his practice into town. He was now a respected family attorney known for his quiet discretion. I called his office one afternoon under the guise of scheduling a consultation for estate planning. Sitting across from him in his quiet, wood-paneled office, I finally let the words spill the affair, the lies, the proof I had been gathering. James listened without interruption, his steady gaze never faltering. When I finished, he leaned forward and said, "Elena, you're not imagining this. You have more than enough to begin protecting yourself." His words gave me the validation I had been starved of. Following his guidance, I opened a private account in my name, carefully moving small amounts of money into it that wouldn't raise suspicion. I checked the mortgage documents and discovered that while my name was listed, Mark had quietly refinanced without discussing it. The realization stung, but it only deepened my resolve. I made copies of every document I could find and stored them at the school in a locked cabinet that only I could access. Meanwhile, I played my part at home with precision. When Mark came in late, I greeted him warmly, asking about his clients. When Tessa dropped by with her easy smile, I poured her coffee and listened as if nothing had changed. They didn't realize that every word they spoke, every slip of detail became another thread in the web I was weaving. I watched their confidence grow, their belief that I was blind, and I let them believe it. There was a night when Mark left his laptop open on the dining room table. He had stepped out to take a phone call, his voice hushed but strained. I walked past and saw an email from Tessa sitting in his inbox, bold and unread. Against the pounding of my heart, I clicked it open. The message was brief, but damning plans for a weekend trip, hotel reservations, already confirmed, a joke about how she'd packed the perfume I hated. I printed it quietly before closing the screen, sliding the copy into the notebook I kept hidden. My quiet steps began to give me strength. The woman who had once cried in silence was gone. In her place was someone deliberate, someone patient. I started exercising again, running in the early mornings when the neighborhood was still asleep. Each step on the pavement felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. I cooked meals that I enjoyed, not just the ones Mark preferred. Even Lily noticed the change, asking one evening why I seemed more like myself. I hugged her tightly, promising her that everything was going to be all right, even if she didn't yet know why. Walter remained a steady presence, though I still kept the details from him. One afternoon, as he repaired a loose step on the back porch, he glanced at me and said, "You've got a steel in you, Elena. Don't ever let anyone take that away." His words echoed James's advice, and I realized the two men saw strength in me long before I allowed myself to feel it. I also began shifting the small routines that had given Mark control. I changed passwords on accounts he never bothered to check, rerouted mail to a locked box at the school, and quietly documented assets we had accumulated. Each move was subtle, invisible to him, yet each one drew a sharper boundary between his control and my independence. The hardest part was maintaining composure when Tessa laughed in my kitchen, or when Mark brushed my shoulder with feigned tenderness. Every gesture tempted me to explode, to shout the truth in their faces. But each time I felt the urge, I pictured the notebook in my purse, the documents locked away, the copies resting in James's files. That reminder calmed me. Revenge would not come from anger. It would come from patience and proof. One evening, after dinner, I walked past the mirror in the hallway and paused. For months, I had avoided my own reflection, unable to meet the eyes of the woman who seemed to be fading. But now I stopped studying the steadiness in my gaze, the quiet fire that had returned. I whispered to myself, "They don't know it yet. But this ends on my terms." The evening everything unraveled began with an invitation. Tessa had planned a lavish birthday dinner for herself at one of the nicer restaurants in town, and of course Mark insisted we attend. He spoke of it casually, as if nothing were amiss, but the tightness around his mouth gave him away. I knew why he wanted me there. He expected me to smile, to play the dutiful wife, while he basked in the presence of his mistress. What he didn't know was that I had already chosen this night as the moment the mask would finally slip. I dressed with care, choosing a simple navy dress and pearl earrings Lily had given me years earlier. In the mirror, I studied the calm in my eyes. I wasn't nervous anymore. I was ready. In my handbag sat the carefully organized folder I had assembled over months, copies of receipts, printed emails, photographs, and even a statement James had helped me draft. Every piece was proof, and tonight it would no longer stay hidden. The restaurant buzzed with laughter and clinking glasses when we arrived. Tessa greeted us at the entrance, her dress shimmering under the lights, her arms stretched wide as if she were welcoming family. She leaned in to hug me, her perfume cloying and familiar, and whispered, "I'm so glad you could make it, Elena." Her smile was practiced, her eyes calculating. I returned the embrace steady and deliberate, then let her slip away to greet the next guest. We were seated at a long table near the center of the room, surrounded by friends and colleagues. Mark slid into the chair beside Tessa, leaving me across from them. The sight almost made me laugh. They had grown so confident in their deceit that they no longer bothered to hide it. But tonight, the audience they had gathered would not serve their pride, it would serve their downfall. The dinner stretched on with wine and laughter, Tessa at the center of every story, Mark quick to echo her jokes. I waited, my hands resting lightly on the folder in my lap, my breathing measured. At last, when the plates were cleared and the chatter began to quiet, I rose from my chair. The sound of my voice carried easily in the room. Before dessert is served, I said evenly, "I think there are some things that need to be said." Every eye turned toward me. Mark's smile faltered, confusion flashing across his face. Tessa tilted her head, feigning curiosity, though I caught the flicker of unease in her eyes. I placed the folder on the table and opened it with slow precision. For months, I continued, I have been told to doubt myself, to ignore the signs, to pretend nothing was wrong. But the truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how carefully it's buried. I slid a stack of printed emails across the table toward Mark. The guests leaned closer, whispers rising as they read the words messages between Mark and Tessa, arranging meetings, booking hotel rooms, mocking the very home they had invaded. "I see now why your business trips ran so long," I said, my voice calm, almost gentle, "and why my oldest friend always seemed to appear when you were gone." Mark's face drained of color. He stammered something about misunderstanding, about private jokes taken out of context, but the evidence was too clear. I laid down the photographs, next grainy but undeniable images of the two of them together at a hotel bar, his hand resting where it had no right to be. Gasps filled the room. One of Tessa's colleagues covered her mouth in shock. Tessa tried to laugh it off, insisting the photos were harmless, that the messages were playful exaggerations. but her voice cracked, her confidence slipping with every passing second. "You're twisting this, Elena," she snapped, her cheeks flushed. "You don't understand." I leaned forward slightly, my gaze fixed on her. "I understand more than you think. I understand that trust once broken can never be restored. And I understand that the two of you thought I would remain silent forever." My hand rested on the final page in the folder bank records showing funds shifted in ways that tied Mark directly to debts he had tried to conceal. I let them sit there exposed under the restaurant lights. The room was silent except for the clinking of a glass dropped by a waiter in the corner. Mark finally stood, his voice rising in panic. "This is ridiculous," he barked. "You're humiliating yourself, Elena." But the tremor in his voice betrayed him. Walter, who had been seated further down the table, rose slowly and placed a steady hand on my shoulder. "No, son," he said quietly, his voice carrying with the weight of age and truth. "She's not the one humiliating herself tonight." The words landed like a verdict. Mark froze, his father's disappointment cutting deeper than anything I could have said. Tessa pushed back her chair, muttering excuses about misunderstandings and personal matters, but no one followed her. The room had turned cold to them both. I gathered the folder and slipped it back into my handbag, my composure unbroken. The truth had been spoken, laid bare for all to see. I didn't need to shout, and I didn't need to fight. Their own actions had condemned them, and now the world knew. When dessert finally arrived, untouched by most of the table, I sat quietly with Walter at my side. Mark avoided my gaze, staring at the tablecloth as if it could swallow him whole. Tessa excused herself early, her voice brittle, her eyes refusing to meet mine. The silence left in their wake was louder than any argument. The fallout came faster than I had expected. The night at the restaurant had been a public unmasking, but the days that followed carried consequences neither Mark nor Tessa could control. Within a week, whispers turned into open conversations. Mark's colleagues began keeping their distance, some canceling meetings, others quietly transferring accounts to different hands. At the same time, Tessa's event clients pulled out of contracts, unwilling to associate their celebrations with a woman whose name had become synonymous with betrayal. I didn't have to chase their downfall. The truth I had released spread on its own, fueled by the very confidence they had once displayed so openly. They had written their own undoing with every message, every careless moment, every arrogant assumption that I would never act. All I had done was shine the light where it needed to be. Mark tried to salvage appearances. He came home late one evening with a bouquet of flowers, their bright petals a pitiful attempt at redemption. He set them on the table and began a practiced speech about forgiveness, about mistakes made in moments of weakness. His words fell flat, empty shells that no longer touched me. I listened in silence, letting him twist, then calmly asked him how he planned to explain the financial documents James had uncovered, accounts drained, debts, hidden his signature on every page. The flowers wilted in the vase within days, just as his excuses withered in my ears. Tessa, for her part, attempted denial. She called me twice, leaving messages that swung between anger and pleading. "You've misunderstood," she said in one. In another, her voice broke as she begged me not to destroy her business. I never returned the calls. There was nothing left to say. She had destroyed herself the moment she stepped into my marriage with her painted smile and her shameless charm. The legal steps began quietly. With James guiding me, I filed for separation and initiated proceedings that would secure my share of the house savings and retirement. I moved carefully, ensuring that every move was documented, every claim backed by the folder I had guarded so closely. Mark tried to contest, but the evidence was overwhelming. The bank statements alone painted a picture of his recklessness. and when paired with the proof of his affair, he had no ground left to stand on. Walter stood by me through it all. One afternoon, as we sat on his porch with the late summer air drifting between us, he placed his hand gently over mine. "I raised him better than this," he said softly, his voice roughened with regret. I squeezed his hand and told him the truth. His son's choices belonged to him alone. Walter nodded, his eyes glistening, and promised me that whatever happened, I would always be part of his family. His support carried me in ways he may never fully know. For Lily, the truth unraveled differently. She overheard whispers at school, saw the pitying glances from neighbors, and finally came to me one evening with trembling hands. "Is it true, Mom?" she asked, her eyes wide and searching. I pulled her close and told her gently that yes, her father had made choices that hurt us both. She cried into my shoulder, her heart breaking in ways I wished I could prevent. But I reminded her that we would move forward together. In that moment, I promised myself that no matter what came next, she would know strength rather than silence. The final collapse of Mark's world came when his company placed him on leave. The affair had been one thing, but the financial irregularities James uncovered had drawn questions from his superiors. Accounts shifted, contracts lost, his reputation had become a liability they could no longer ignore. The man who once strutted into boardrooms with polished shoes and confident smiles now sat in our kitchen, staring at the floor, the weight of his ruin pressing down. Tessa fared no better. Her once bustling calendar of weddings and galas thinned to nothing. Her name whispered with disdain rather than admiration. She tried to launch a new business under a different brand, but the community knew her too well. Her invitations went unanswered, her calls unreturned. The same charm she once wielded so easily had become her cage. Through it all, I did not gloat. I did not raise my voice or shout my victory. I simply moved forward with deliberate grace, one step at a time. My strength was not in their destruction. It was in the quiet dignity of reclaiming my life. They had chosen betrayal. I had chosen truth, and truth once spoken needed no defense. The night the court granted my separation and secured the home in my name, I stood alone in the living room, the silence surrounding me. The walls that had once echoed with doubt now felt lighter, freer. Mark's things were gone, his presence reduced to shadows that no longer held power. For the first time in months, I exhaled without the weight pressing on my chest. The silence in my home after Mark left felt different. It wasn't the heavy quiet of suspicion or grief, it was the kind that carries peace. The rooms seemed lighter, as if the walls themselves had exhaled. For the first time in months, I could walk through my own doorway without bracing for disappointment or deceit. I spent evenings sitting on the porch with Lily, watching the sun sink behind the trees. She carried her own scars from what she had learned about her father, but I saw resilience in her eyes. We spoke honestly about hurt, about strength, and about the importance of knowing one's worth. Each conversation wove us closer together, not just as mother and daughter, but as women who would not let betrayal define them. Walter remained a steady presence, his quiet support reminding me that not all bonds are broken by the mistakes of others. Sometimes we sat in silence, sometimes we talked about the past, but always there was an unspoken respect between us. He had seen his son fall, but he chose to lift me up instead. That choice spoke louder than any apology could have. Tessa faded into the background of the town, her name no longer celebrated, but whispered with pity. Mark's career never recovered, his reputation shadowed by the choices he made. I didn't chase either of them down, and I didn't need to. Justice doesn't always look like punishment. It often looks like the absence of power. They had taken so much from me, but in the end, they were left only with themselves. As for me, I reclaimed more than just my home. I reclaimed my dignity, my voice, and the quiet certainty that I had not only survived, but emerged stronger. I no longer doubted my instincts or silenced my own truth. Instead, I built a life on honesty and steadiness, teaching Lily by example that strength is not about shouting the loudest. It is about standing unshaken when others try to tear you down. If there is one lesson I carry with me now, it is this. Betrayal may shake the foundation, but it cannot take away the core of who you are unless you allow it. And when the storm passes, what remains is not weakness, but resilience. Before we close, I'd love to know what part of this journey spoke most to you. Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you'd like to hear more true family stories where dignity finds its voice, stay connected here.